The Battle of Yarmouk is one of history's greatest battles, arguably the largest in which Muslims fought. It was here that the Muslim armies first met those of the Sassanid Persians and the Byzantine Greeks in a battle, which decided not only who would rule the Middle East, but also the course of human history. The year before, in 634 AD, Muslim army had defeated the Sassanid Persians at the Battle of al-Walid near Damascus. The Muslims' leader, the great general Khalid ibn al-Walid, had maneuvered his army into a position from where they could attack their larger Persian opponents at will. The bulk of the Persian cavalry was made up of cataphracts, heavily armored horsemen, who were nearly impenetrable when they came in tight formations. But because of the terrain around al-Walid, they were unable to use this tactic against the Muslims, and so they broke and ran. It was one of the most decisive victories of the early Islamic period and opened up Syria for conquest. But it also attracted the attention of the Byzantine Greeks. The Emperor Heraclius had been fighting his own war against the Persians for years. But hearing of the Arab threat, he called off the war and marched west with all the army he could spare. When Khalid ibn al-Walid heard about this, he retreated from Syria to meet the new threat. He was eventually joined by Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, who commanded the Muslim forces in Iraq. Together, they led an army numbering between 20,000 and 40,000 men to the banks of the Yarmouk River, just east of the Sea of Galilee. There they faced the Byzantines. When the two sides met in the summer of 636, the Byzantines had the advantage in numbers and equipment. They also had the advantage in experience, for many of the Muslim soldiers had never fought a battle before. So it seemed that the odds were stacked against the Muslims. Yet we know how this battle ended. The Muslim army won, inflicting heavy casualties on the imperial troops and chasing them all the way back to their camps. Many Byzantine soldiers were able to escape during the night, but thousands were killed and tens of thousands taken prisoner. Among them was the emperor's son. Heraclius himself escaped only by the skin of his teeth. This victory opened up Syria and Palestine for the Muslims, who went on to conquer the rest of the Levant and North Africa over the next few decades. Had the Muslims lost the battle, though, then things may have turned out very differently. The Byzantines might have pushed them back into the Arabian Peninsula, and the Arab world might have looked very different today. So let's explore what would have happened had the Byzantines won at Yarmouk. After winning the Battle of Yarmouk, Khalid ibn al-Walid continued on to Jerusalem and captured the city, which was followed by the Muslim conquest of Palestine and Syria. Only Egypt remained under Byzantine control. However, this campaign had stretched the Muslim forces rather thin, and there was talk of retreating back to Arabia. But Abu Ubaidah thought that if they gave up now, then the Byzantines would recover and launch a counterattack. So he convinced the other Muslim leaders to stay put and keep fighting. And they did. Abu Ubaidah campaigned in Syria for another 2 years, taking cities like Antioch and Damascus. But meanwhile, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius was preparing for a counterattack. As soon as he heard about the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, he set about raising an army, one so large that it would make the previous one look tiny by comparison. According to some sources, Heraclius raised an army of 150,000 men, while others say it was more like 80,000. Either way, it was huge. This force was composed of not only regular soldiers, but also irregular levies and volunteers. Men of all ages were pressed into service. Even monks were forced to leave their monasteries and take up arms. All of these raw recruits were given iron armor taken from the imperial armories and made into shock troops under the command of experienced officers. Some sources even say that Heraclius ordered the recall of his son-in-law, the former Emperor Phocas, who had been deposed a few years earlier and was living in exile in Africa. When Heraclius finished mustering his army, he marched them to the Yarmouk River and began the long process of crossing it. As the last of the troops were ferried across, the emperor received word that the Muslims had abandoned their fortifications and were marching away. Thinking that the Arabs were retreating before his superior numbers, Heraclius gave chase. The two armies met once again on the banks of the Yarmouk, but this time the situation was reversed. The Byzantines were fresh and full of religious zeal, while the Muslims were exhausted and demoralized after weeks of campaigning. And to top it off, the Muslims were once again outnumbered. Even though the Muslim commanders knew they were no match for the Byzantine army, they decided to stand and fight anyway. Abu Ubaidah wanted to buy time for the rest of the Muslim forces to regroup and recover, so he led a small force to meet the Byzantines in battle. Meanwhile, the rest of the army retreated into the city of Emesa. Abu Ubaidah hoped that the Byzantines would follow him and that the rest of his army would be able to escape. But it didn't work out that way. Heraclius's shock troops charged into battle with great force and broke through the Muslim lines, killing or capturing all who stood in their way. Some Byzantine historians claim that Heraclius himself led the charge, brandishing a golden spear. While this is almost certainly a myth, it does show just how much of a hero the emperor was in the eyes of his people. As the Muslim lines broke and fled, Heraclius gave the order to pursue them. His troops chased the Muslims all the way back to Emesa, where they massacred all who tried to enter the city. Those that did get in were forced to flee into the desert, where they died of thirst and exposure. By the end of the day, the Muslim army was in full flight. Thousands had been killed and tens of thousands taken prisoner. The rest fled to Iraq, never to return. For the Byzantines, this was one of their greatest victories in the East, perhaps second only to the Battle of Manzikert. What's more, they had inflicted a decisive defeat on the Arabs, breaking their military power and ending their advance into Syria. In the aftermath of the battle, Heraclius reorganized his empire, appointing generals to govern the eastern provinces and giving them large sums of money and supplies to raise and equip new armies. He then spent the next few years campaigning against the Sassanids, taking back all the territory they had conquered during the previous war. At the same time, the Muslims were busy consolidating their conquests in Arabia itself. There were a number of rebellions in the newly conquered territories, but they were all put down. By the end of the 640s, Muslim armies were once again poised for action and ready to take on the Byzantines once more. But now, it was the Byzantines who were prepared and ready to defend their land. To see how the Muslims eventually won, in spite of this Byzantine victory, check out my other videos on the Muslim conquest of the Levant. If the Byzantines had won at Yarmouk, then it is likely that the Muslims would have been driven back into the Arabian Peninsula, and the Arab world might look very different today. Perhaps the Muslims would have reconquered the Levant centuries later, but maybe they wouldn't. It's impossible to say for sure. But one thing is for sure, the course of history would have been very different. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for watching.